November 4, 1979 was a day that had a profound impact on me and on my country. On that day, a rabble of Islamic revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and took 52 Americans hostage. Their ordeal would last 444 days. Mine would last much longer. You see, some 7,000 miles away from that embassy in suburban St. Louis, Missouri, I was a 12-year-old middle schooler. I considered myself a pretty typical Midwestern American, God-fearing and patriotic. I love Cardinals baseball, hot dogs, apple pie. I was born in New York, even named after a venerated American president, FDR. This was the only country, the only home I'd ever known. But there was a problem. In the early 1960s, years before I was born, my parents had immigrated to this country from Iran, the very country that was now waging a violent attack on America. And as images of Iranian citizens chanting "Death to America" scrolled across the nightly TV newscasts, our own populace became riled up as jingoistic fervor melded with mass hysteria and deep-seated prejudice to declare Iran and Iranians the enemy. Now, while all this was happening, I had the misfortune of being in 7th grade. Because as many of you know, 7th graders are probably the cruelest people in the world. They brought the prejudices and angers and fears of their parents from home to school. And my brother Ray and I were the only two Iranians in a middle school of over 1,000 students. And we made easy targets. To our classmates, we didn't count as real Americans. We were foreigners, outsiders, hostiles. It didn't matter that we weren't even Muslim, or that we practiced the Baha'i faith, the minority religion in Iran that those same Islamic revolutionaries were persecuting with grotesque fervor. In St. Louis, I was experiencing my own persecution. The bullying, the threats, the physical violence became a daily and then an hourly affair. My main nemesis was a kid called Brian. He'd been an antagonist of mine since 5th grade, but he decided that now he had a particularly good reason to pick on me. So Brian and his gang of bullies began a relentless campaign of attacks and insults that made me feel like I too had been taken hostage. Just one that they didn't talk about on the evening news. One incident was particularly harrowing. One day I was sitting in social studies class, learning about the Constitution, when Brian walked up from outside the classroom and saw me sitting in the front row. He pointed at me and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Ayatollah Amanat, fuck you!" He then spat at me, gave me the finger, and ran down the hallway, unscathed, while some of the kids nearby clapped and cheered with approval. It was the most humiliating moment of my life, and one that haunted my nightmares for years to come. I had become a pariah, and it's really difficult for a pariah to make or to keep friends. At lunch, I sat with a posse of about 8 kids who had stayed loyal to me despite what was going on. Most of them were misfits and outcasts like myself, but one was not. Todd was a smart, popular, good-looking kid who'd been my best friend since 3rd grade, and had stayed loyal to me and stuck with me through thick and thin, until he didn't. Early in 8th grade, it had all become too much for him, and Todd decided that his popularity was more important to him than my friendship. So he turned against me too, and took about half of my posse with him, leaving me with a tiny group of loyal friends. It was a devastating betrayal, and I never felt so heartbroken or so alone. Todd and I had once been inseparable, but we never spoke again, and in high school we became bitter rivals. Now you might think that a series of painful events such as this would have caused me to turn against my country, or perhaps would have pushed me to gravitate more towards my Persian heritage. But that's not how I'm wired. If anything, my earnest desire for belonging, for acceptance, pushed me to love my country and its people even more, despite their flaws, despite their imperfections. I never wavered in my identity as American, because I knew in my heart that what amazing things this country could accomplish if we only stayed true to our values that knit us together as a nation. Now, the hostage crisis ended when I was in the middle of 8th grade, and life went on. The bullying and ostracism continued on and off through high school, but I wouldn't let it beat me or turn me into an angry victim. Instead, I put my head down, focused on my studies, and ended up graduating valedictorian of my class. I went on to college and then law school, and eventually became a federal prosecutor. Ironically, I understand that Todd became a public defender while Brian went to prison. Now, about 18 years after Brian and his gang of bullies had insisted that I had no business calling me an American, things came full circle for me when I marched into a Brooklyn courtroom as an assistant United States attorney and introduced myself as Frank Amanat on behalf of the United States of America. It was a mantra I would repeat hundreds of times in my next 24 years of service to my country, and I never again felt like an outsider. Thank you.